I'm Nancy Netzer, a member of the board of the Massachusetts Foundation on the Humanities, and a professor of art history and director of the McMullen Museum here at Boston College. I'm so pleased that the foundation has chosen to host its 30th anniversary celebration at Boston College. And I would like to congratulate and thank the board of the Massachusetts Foundation on the Humanities, the staff of the Massachusetts Foundation, as well as my colleagues here at Boston College, especially Father Leahy, Jack Newhouser, Ben Birnbaum, Hallie Sammartino, Keith Ake, and David Early for all that they've done to make today's events a reality. The third and final panel this afternoon is the President and his enemies, a topic that for all of us gray-hairs has engaged and periodically obsessed us throughout our lifetimes. In fact, I first saw one of our panelists daily on television when I didn't have gray hair just a few years ago. With us to discuss this topic are Joyce Appleby, Professor Emerita of History at the University of California, Los Angeles, and author of Capitalism and a New Social Order, The Jeffersonian Vision of the 1790s, Liberalism and Republicanism in the Historical Imagination, and Thomas Jefferson. James MacGregor Burns, a Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential biographer and the author most recently of Transforming Leadership, The New Pursuit of Happiness. John Dean, who became White House counsel to President Nixon at the age of 31 and served as Richard Nixon's White House lawyer for 1,000 days. Mr. Dean has written 6 books, including a biography of Warren Harding. His newest book is Worse Than Watergate: The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush. The moderator will be David Halberstam, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, historian, and author of 16 books, including The Best and the Brightest, and War in a Time of Peace, Bush, Clinton, and the Generals, which was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So let me thank all of our panelists and turn this over to our moderator.
Well, I'm the moderator, and I have a good credentials for the press and its president and its enemies, because I went 2 for 3 on the presidents. John Kennedy asked the publisher to pull me out of Vietnam when I was there in 1963, and Lyndon Johnson, taking time off from his extremely difficult duties as President of the United States to double as Minister of Patriotism, said that my young colleague Neil Sheehan and I were traitors to our country. But regrettably, I did not make the Nixon enemies list, and that would have given me the hat trick, and it's been an enormous disappointment in our family. My daughter has held it against me on occasions. Our group is self-evidently distinguished. It self-evidently spans the time from Jefferson to the present. We huddled on the phone the other day, and we sort of thought maybe we could divide it a little bit into genuine enemies that the presidents have, and then, in effect, the self-inflicted wounds of presidents who, out of their paranoia, create enemies where enemies don't exist. And I thought that one of the nice things about the panel at this particular moment would be this sense that the great thing that history does, when you use it well, is that it cushions the present. It gives you a sense that this is not the first time that the nation has gone through some crisis, that there has been polarization, that the people who thought they were smarter feel, and I'm sure believe they have higher SATs than their counterparts in the red America and are therefore burning with anger. it's not the first time, and history will go on, and we will survive and endure. And so I thought, we're reaching a lot of American history. I hope we can connect with each other. But we're going to start with about 6 or 7 minutes from each panelist. And I thought that we'd maybe go chronologically, and that therefore I would start with Joyce Appleby. And we'll just, maybe it'll work and maybe it won't, but you can't get your money back.
Well, I think political parties create enemies, and they certainly had an explosive effect on George Washington's first administration. And the Founding Fathers had simply not anticipated there would be political parties. They had known that there were going to be differences of opinion, as there were with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or earlier there was, in the state legislatures there were creditor and debtor parties. But they did not anticipate organized parties, and they weren't prepared either psychologically or intellectually for political parties when they did emerge. They were, all of them, trained as politicians in a colonial era in which political discussion was a very decorous affair. It was done among gentlemen behind closed doors. And Jefferson opened those doors when he went out to animate, organize, inspire the public to oppose Washington's policies. And swiftly, after you had this open opposition, you had newspapers that were created, newspapers that published bold critiques of the Federalist policies. They were often scurrilous in their attacks, even reviling this revered of all presidents, George Washington. They leaked state secrets. They threw out to the public issues that had formerly been discussed only by those in the leadership group. And in the process, they created an intolerable situation for most of the men in political life, because they still had a sense of their honor, and they weren't accustomed to having their opinions broadcast in newspapers or to have them misrepresented and distorted. So there was a tremendous amount of anguish that was associated with the political parties in the first 3 decades of the 19th century and the closing 7 years of the 18th. I mean, men who had fought in arms in the Continental Congress, had fought in the Continental Army, but were also men who had been delegates to the Continental Congress and had worked through these, decade of fighting for independence and negotiating peace treaties. These men would cross the street rather than give hat service to one another, rather than acknowledge one another politely. So deep were these divisions. Jefferson, when he became president, hoped that he could moderate and soothe this acrimony and vituperation that had filled the public domain. And you may recall in his first inaugural address, he said we were all Republicans, we were all Federalists. This was an effort to reach out and bind the nation. Well, it didn't work. His election only cemented the political divisions that had already existed. Benjamin Silliman, a Federalist lawyer, said that he marveled that his friends were like ravenous wolves when they talked about politics, even though they were the most amiable disposition otherwise. And James Hamilton's son, said that there was no end to the venom that parties had caused in communities. Doctors, if they wanted to practice in a community, if they were a Federalist or a Jeffersonian, wanted to be sure that there were enough patients for 2 practices, because people wouldn't go to a doctor of an opposite party. But the most telling development of this period was dueling. And we've been commemorating Alexander Hamilton's death this year and his fatal duel with Burr. That was one of many, many, many duels. Hamilton's son himself had been killed in a duel the year previously for mocking a Jeffersonian speech. A newspaper in Delaware in 1824 estimated that 100 men had been killed in duels. That doesn't even count the ones who were wounded or where challenges were somehow mediated. And the fascinating thing in the United States is that 3/4 of the duels were about politics. Dueling had been introduced through the French and German English officers who fought in the Continental Army. And with them, dueling was a question of honor, but it was mainly about gambling and women. What was remarkable about the United States is that it was politics. There was even a dueling field in Bladensburg, Maryland, that was called the Congressional Dueling Grounds. People were almost challenged on the floor of Congress to a duel, and this persisted, as I said, for about 30 years. Now, what this phenomenon tells me is that these men did not have a concept of an issue. That is to say, a subject upon which good men could differ, where there could be honest differences of opinion. And that had to be cultivated. That was a necessary part of the democratization of American politics, of opening the doors to ordinary people's participating. And it's kind of fascinating that we have returned to a situation in which there is a tremendous amount of acrimony and rancor in politics. And I think we're going to have to figure out ways to recover that sense of an issue. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I think that in terms of what we're talking about today, it is this inability to be tolerant of one another, to moderate one's views, or to have the capacity to compromise that turns opponents into enemies.
Let us go. Thank you. Very nicely done, and we can carry through on that. Jim, can you take us a little further into our history in your comfort zone?
Well, on the question of conflict, I will outrage you by saying that I believe in conflict. I believe in polarization. I think we should have more polarization, but everything depends on how we define these terms. One reason I got interested in FDR to write about him was that I felt he raised questions about values or morality that would help one understand this kind of phenomena. And I'm going to just run through a little bit on FDR, then come back to this very difficult question we've really been talking about all afternoon, which is, again, this overused word, values. FDR was not a virtuous man by the usual definitions of virtue. He was unfaithful to his wife, and we could mention other aspects of his life, but he was not a virtuous man in that traditional sense. He often was not an ethical man. He, in the ordinary world of politics, he did not live up to promises. He dissembled, he fibbed, lied, if you wish, and so on. But what seems to me the most crucial value is the level of public values. And that's, it seems to me, where he was magnificent. And I go through this because everybody has to make a definition, and particularly in a university like this, about which of these sets of moral values or ethics or virtues, which do you feel are more important? What is your hierarchy of these elements of leadership? Mine, I think I should make clear. I think people should be virtuous, but I don't test politicians particularly on virtue. We had a discussion of this earlier. I believe in ethical connections. It's particularly important to what many students here will be going into, politics, business, law, especially law, the importance of ethics. But at the top of my hierarchy, not necessarily your hierarchy, are the great public values. So if I put that much emphasis in terms of transforming leadership, leadership for change, leadership for intended change, leadership for principled change, leadership for enduring change, if I put that much emphasis on public values as against something that might be different for you, then again, it seems to me I have to rate Roosevelt at a very high level. Our excellent participant earlier, David Gergen, feels that Roosevelt was devious. He's absolutely right. American politics in particular makes for deviousness. But the question I would raise, because I would put deviousness at the level of ethics. So obviously to me, deviousness is not the crucial point. The crucial point is what you do, what you believe in, what changes you make. And if you look at Roosevelt in this spirit and think about not only the New Deal, not only winning World War II with his allies, but pronouncing some of the most magnificent statements about the top level of public values. I need not remind you of the four freedoms, but the important thing was not just orating about these great values, but carrying them out. And one of the lesser-known aspects of the Roosevelt administration is the war years, where he not only was fighting the fight for freedom against the most horrendous enemies we've ever had, but to a greater extent than most historians, I think, have realized, he was carrying out his compassionate New Deal programs in World War II. And being devious, he sort of fooled people about this, because he said he was going to shift from Dr. New Deal to Dr. Win the War. I never thought that was the best wordage of this, but I thought he made a very good point. The amazing thing is, for any of you who remember the World War, even as youngsters, is how much of the New Deal was actually carried out in the Second World War. It's really rather tragic in a way that it should happen this way. The New Deal itself had not been wholly successful, particularly in reemployment. In World War II, I hate to say this, but I think aside from those who lost members of their family or friends in the war for good and other horrible aspects of the war, the American people never had it so good as in World War II. First of all, he was carrying out the fight for freedom instead of just talking about it. Secondly, he was connecting freedom with these fundamental changes that he had tried to bring about during the New Deal. So it seems to me, and this could all be developed at great length, but it seems to me that FDR in this sense not only, in my view, expresses these great values and particularly carries out my hierarchy of values, but he stands as a wonderful symbol of what can be done in a depression situation and then in a frightful war situation, what can be done by committed leadership. It's because despite these failures of his, I should just mention, because I like to be somewhat balanced treating Roosevelt, I think his most egregious failure was right at the top of my hierarchy, and that was the so-called relocation of the Japanese during World War II. We call it relocation as though it were sort of a real estate operation, location. Actually, we should face the fact that we Americans put Japanese Americans into concentration camps. That's what they were, concentration camps. People put into trains, moved into distant areas, guarded, surrounded by barbed wire and guards for indefinite periods. So he could fail too, but having admitted what to my mind was the greatest failure of FDR, I would say that this is a man who had his hierarchy of values quite straight. And naturally, I feel that way because they happen to be my hierarchy of values.
I would make one small footnote, and I'm going to talk about it later tonight in my speech, and that is when Jim talks about public values, there's always a shift in historiography. It is not a static profession, and there has been a shift because of the commercial marketplace from an emphasis on what might have been, as the era of Roosevelt, Kennedy, Clinton particularly, from public values, studying that part of a presidency, to the private values, the titillation of that part of the president's life, because in the current marketplace, connected as it is to television, the rewards are greater. I'd like to go on to John Dean. I was thinking about duels when Joyce mentioned them. I thought maybe you might have done a duel with John Ehrlichman at a certain point. I would be a little nervous had you done it, because you'd have probably had a single-shot weapon, and he might have quite well showed up with an AK-47. I don't know. You have an extraordinary window on a president and enemies, because you were there when a man who really governed from the center, or even maybe from the liberal center, was reinaugurated with an enormous majority, effectively 60-40, and it all crashed. And I thought that window might be very interesting here to hear.
Well, in the context of the topic today, and the shifting reputations of presidents and presidents and their enemies, I was a little confused as to why I was on this panel. I wasn't sure whether it was because I'm probably on a couple enemies lists, or because I did in fact reveal a so-called enemies list that was kept by Richard Nixon. I think that it's odd, in some 30 years since I revealed that fact during my Senate testimony, the record of what really happened, I don't think, has ever been corrected by any historian. To the best of my knowledge, Richard Nixon was totally unaware of the so-called enemies list. The enemies list was prepared by a man who worked in Chuck Colson's office as a $1 a year consultant. And he was asked, there's no question that Richard Nixon believed he had enemies. He couldn't, if we make this transition from separating opponents into people as perceived enemies, Nixon certainly had his fair share. But he didn't have the literal long list, if you will, that emerged as a result of my Senate testimony when the collections that George Bell had gathered became incorporated into the so-called enemies list. There was a small refined list, but not a very massive list. So I don't think we've ever gotten that straight. Now, having been something of a student of the presidency for both as an undergraduate and graduate, and then having been inside the operation, one draws a certain conclusion about who might be the natural enemies of presidents and their reputations. And I think I'm sitting on a panel with the natural enemies of presidents, historians and journalists. And presidents believe that. I think most of them can separate opponents from enemies, and they do perceive many in the press and many who will write their history as their enemies. When working on a biography of Warren Harding, who I don't think had any real enemy when he was president, a biography I had great fun doing because I think history has gotten him so wrong. When he did die in office, he indeed discovered he had many enemies, and they were more philosophical enemies that went after him, and they were primarily journalists and not historians. For Nixon, I think that Nixon has proven himself to be his own worst enemy. As Bob Woodward says about his tapes, the tapes are the gift that keep on giving, and it has been endless for all these years. And probably we have still not. I think there are another 1,000 hours of tapes yet to be released. So Nixon's personality, his governing style, his entire operation is revealed to the world as no presidency ever has been before. And it's not very pretty. We're inside the sausage-making machine. And the way it is ground out is, I say, not always very attractive.
I wondered, I mean, it really was greatly self-inflicted, wasn't it? I mean, he sort of, almost psychologically needed people to be against him, his old, whether it was the East Coast people who had gone to colleges he hadn't gone to or whatever. I mean, there was really an emotional need for that, wasn't there?
Well, there was a very interesting shift in the Nixon White House. When I first went in the White House, it was rather open. As White House counsel, I wanted to know what the rules would be for working with the Congress and providing documents and things of that nature. Same with the press office, and it was a pretty open policy. It isn't until the leak of the so-called Pentagon Papers in June of 1971 where you really have a defining moment in the Nixon presidency. Every bit as defining to the Nixon presidency as 9/11 would be to the Bush presidency. And after the Pentagon Papers come out, it is a dramatic shift in the entire attitude. That's when the so-called illegal activities, that's when you create the plumbers unit, that's when Nixon really increases the number of people he perceives as his enemies and takes extreme actions and illegal actions which he wants to justify in the name of national security. And it's truly the imperial presidency unchecked and gone wild.
Joyce, I wondered if you might ponder something and free associate, but it strikes me that in the evolution of the presidency, in the parallel evolution of America as a great power into a superpower, into an almost hyperpower, that the pressures on the president are inclined to become greater and greater, almost in a way unbearable. They're not just domestic pressures. There are pressures from this country, that country, this group. At the same time, there is an immediacy of access to, whether it's print or now television or internet, to its critics. And I wondered if as well the process to get to the presidency is so distorted and hyped up that the pressure, the emotional pressure over the 150 years or more of American history has gotten worse. And secondly, are we picking out people who by their nature, interesting little thing, are more egocentric and therefore more likely to personalize things with enemies? Would you like to just, that's a nice little question that you could get 4 books out of. Would you like to play with that?
I'm thinking that I think what you say about the campaigning is critically important, because to an astounding degree, the men who were the revolutionary elite continued to govern America into the third decade of the 19th century. In other words, they were the pool of men. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Monroe, and they didn't have to fight vigorously to be nominated, nor did they have to go to the public to be nominated, certainly not in the same way. So that is a filter that's quite different. Here you have a filter which is really more like the British system of men who impress their peers and rise to the top and are the acknowledged leaders, as opposed to having to go out to the public and, as it were, sell yourself. So I think that's very different, and it certainly has had an enormous influence on the kind of people who have become nominated, or wanted, as you say, to become nominated, people who could even stand this kind of competition and exposure. But I'm not sure the pressures of the presidency are much greater. Yes, we can certainly say that it's a much more complicated universe over which they are concerned, but the Founding Fathers had a tremendous sense that they had done something astounding, that they were the last best hope of the earth. I mean, it was sort of an exaggerated sense of the importance of what they had done in creating, but it was, after all, a little country of quondam colonies. It wasn't as though the whole world thought America was going to be what America is in the 21st century, but they felt that way. And they felt that in foreign policy. Here they are leading the country at the time of this Titanic war, the Napoleonic Wars between France and England. How are they going to keep this country afloat? There was still grave uncertainty as whether or not the United States would occupy the North American continent. English had a stance, Spanish, French. So I think the pressures were every bit as great. One of the things that interests me, and it's a little bit about what John Dean has talked about, though not quite the same, but one of the pressures on Jefferson was how to form a civil service, how to fill the patronage positions he had with people loyal to him, loyal to his party, and not outrage people who had offices, whether they were justice of the peace or customs collectors. And this was probably the most onerous responsibility he had, was appointing people to office. And Jefferson was also maybe not collecting in the enemies list, but he was very concerned with everyone who had a civil office, and he asked for a list of everyone over the captain, commissioned in the Army above, and he went through all these names, and he was interested in their competency, but he was also interested in their political position. And he struggled with this sense of offices continuing and having their rights, and the need to build an opposition party that could also be a ruling party and have in them people who had experience. And this created enmity. This is one of the reasons for the break between Jefferson and John and Abigail Adams, was because he cleared John Quincy Adams out of a job in Boston. So I think there are lots of sources of enmity, and particularly, as I stressed before, when you go from the sense of a group of people born to be rulers to creating a full public participatory politics. And it's only been, these pressures only been exacerbated by the campaigns that you're talking about, where all of these loyalties come and play a part in getting elected. They didn't have that, but they certainly had party building as a source of conflict, a source of enmity. And as I said, wherever you're going to have parties, you're going to have enemies.
Jim, would you like to comment on the same question?
No, I think it's been very well covered.
You're absolutely, I mean, you're not allowed on a panel if you're going to agree on that.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
I would make the same point in a somewhat different way. I think part of the problem with the American presidency is the personalization of it, and the fact that there is not the most important quality in leadership in a democracy, which is shared leadership or collective leadership. And this is being particularly obvious today because of what Bush is doing in the White House, converting an already rather lean cabinet, rather focused group, into an even more so group by the kinds of appointments he's making. And this really relates to a broader question of the American system, and that is the power of the presidency as a collective operation having to deal with two other separate entities. Although again, we're watching a situation today where because there is one-party control, we're not getting the kind of opposition needed. So to sum up this point for the moment, I would argue that what we basically need in this country is a much more collective leadership at the national level, perhaps the other levels, and at the same time a much stronger opposition. This does relate to something that has been mentioned, which is the decline of political parties. For decades, political scientists have been talking about the decline of political parties, while the political parties have continued to decline. But this is something getting back into the 19th century and early 20th is a great contrast. And we've lost a tremendously important strengthening and stabilizing aspect of the American presidency, because the president's with his own party, his own group, is out there alone. Nixon is simply one of the more extreme examples, and we're losing the kind of capacity that European parliamentary democracies have, where you have a president or typically a prime minister who has solid backing in his party, and particularly in his cabinet, a great deal of shared leadership in the cabinet, and always the need to deal with the opposition, which is equally articulate in Parliament, and gives you the very important choice. And I wanted to get this point made too, because we've been talking in the panel and outside the panels today about turnout in the election this year. which everybody was touting as would be a great increase. And I anxiously awaited this because we have been going at around 50%, 52% turnout in presidential elections. And it was understood that we were going to be much better this year with all the tremendous effort that was made. The last statistic I've heard is that it's either in the, depending on how you count it, in the upper 50s, maybe 60. And to my mind, as part of this whole problem that we're talking about, the absence of 40% or 45% of the voters, or would-be voters, or potential voters in these elections is something that is not much discussed. And I keep asking, why? After all the hullabaloo, all the emphasis for a whole year on the election, typically 50 or 45% of the people do not vote. And so I'm sometimes asked, well, why not? And I'm not sure why not. I wish we knew more about this. But I think one reason relates to the whole discussion we're having this afternoon. And that is, if you ask most of these people why they didn't vote, they would say, it doesn't matter.
But I think it does obviously matter. I think sometimes this election was unusual in that such a vast part of the country felt it was a fait accompli, that if you were in the very red, you were in the red, and you were in the blue, you were in the blue, and if you were in New York, it in effect didn't matter because it was contested but uncontested. It was as if we were in the press box or on the sidelines in an election that was being fought out in Ohio, Florida. I have rarely had a sense of being so powerless in an election in terms of my own franchise, because unless I went to Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Florida, my vote wouldn't mean. John, I wondered, and we'll take questions from the audience after this, but I thought that Jim Burns said something very interesting and really quite eloquent, talking about Roosevelt earlier and the public values of his purposeful White House, even though his private values weren't necessarily that attractive, something that would always seem to me to be something that was between him and Mrs. Roosevelt, just as what was amiss in the Kennedy White House was between the President and the First Lady, and right into the Clinton one. You served and have now written about a second White House where, in effect, the private values are values that would be now embraced in the changing definition of values that we have in this country. Public values seem to be in a televised age, and an age of where there have been 25 mini-series on the Kennedys, none about what was happening in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a great many about who was and wasn't doing what to whom. I would wonder if you would just do a little bit for us on being in those, writing about one and being a part of a second of what happens. What is it like when the private values are acceptable but to a mass of the country, but the public values, in fact, seem somewhat skewered, and indeed, in the case of, for instance, Nixon, almost hostile towards a greater good or resentment of the American people? Is there it's almost, sometimes I think of Nixon and I think of a virus.
David, let me put it in and I don't mean to be cynical in addressing it this way, but it was one of the real eye-openers to me when I went into the Nixon White House. It's one of the things that I've seen repeated in this Bush first administration, where all of the public considerations, if you will, whether they be foreign or domestic, are through the lens of what it means for re-election. The entire first term of both these presidencies have been devoted to getting a second term. I can't think of almost any decision that Nixon made during his first term that wasn't so considered. That being the key public value for Richard Nixon: will this help or hurt me get back in? That was one of the reasons that I, of course, was critical of the Bush administration. We have not seen, since Nixon, a perpetual campaign. We didn't have it with Ford. We didn't have it with Carter. We did with Reagan to a degree, but nothing like Nixon or later Bush II. We didn't have it with Bush I. To the contrary, he didn't want political people influencing his decision-making. We did have it to a degree with Clinton.
A bit of it in Clinton, I think.
Yes, yeah. But not to the degree of Nixon. And we're back
he managed to be two Clintons. Yes. I think at critical points.
But in trying to judge the sort of the personal side of the man versus the politician, if you will, these men are political creatures, and they don't get there by being timid. They don't get there by being anything less than fairly large in ego. And that, to me, has been one of the masteries of Dick Cheney's role. George Bush is a very good head of state. He's not a very good head of government. He doesn't like the minutia, whereas Nixon did. Nixon loved his homework and would go off with it and get deep into it. But we have a presidency now where our head of government, if you will, we don't see much of. And I think he's the vice president, and I think Cheney's genius as a former chief of staff and a former cabinet officer. He is clever enough to let George Bush wake up every morning and actually believe he is president.
We are about halfway through, and we have these microphones, and we would be very appreciative of questions that are questions and don't go on too long.
We all know that second terms are particularly prone to overreach, ending in disaster. I think some of the comments have agreed with my expectations that this is likely to happen with George W. Bush. I wonder if anyone can add to what's already been at least suggested along these lines.
I'd certainly tackle that. I think George Bush has a good chance of escaping that problem, and I'll tell you why. Not because I don't think there are reasons. There may be, I've counted at least 12, there may be another dozen incipient or inchoate scandals that could unfold in this presidency. But given the fact that we have a unified one-party rule in Washington, there is absolutely no check. The media really isn't capable of getting in there and digging out these sort of things. They really wait for others and then report when another investigation is going on.
There could be leaks like Watergate.
Well, you've got to, that's an assumption that I can't agree with. Watergate, if you recall, fell apart of its own weight. Watergate occurs, the break-in occurs in June of 1972. It is not until April of 73 that Watergate begins to fall apart. And in that interim, the Washington Post, while they were diligent in reporting stories, I think Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein would be the first to tell you, they didn't come close to cracking the case. So, as I see it, there's no likelihood of press doing it. And the other thing that is gone that has caused so many presidents since Watergate such a problem is the independent counsel statute. Given that triggering device no longer being in existence, as I say, the likelihood of Bush being confronted with it, unless he loses the Senate in 2006, I think he will be unscathed.
Does anybody want to add something?
Yes. Just as a PS to that, it seems to me that the worst aspect of that amendment that was passed to get spite Roosevelt, or Roosevelt's memory, that is the anti-third term amendment, was the most irresponsible thing, because putting aside the FDR aspect of it, you're creating automatically a presidency that is not going to be tested at the polls. You're automatically creating a lame duck presidency. So I'm one of those who favor the repeal of the third-term amendment, so that we might have more responsibility, because even though typically we will not want a president to serve 3 terms, we want presidents, I think, in the second term who think they might want to serve a 3rd term.
I would make one footnote to that, and that is, I think it's going to be a very hard presidency. I mean, he may get through it and all, but it's not a mandate. Not a mandate on Iraq, believe me. It's not a mandate on the economy. I think that they did a much better job. I think 2 things caused the election. One, the residue, still, the power, the leverage from September 11th to an already rather evenly divided country, and the fact that Rove and his people did a better job of getting his army out than the Democrats did in these selected battlegrounds. Ohio, I think, is a particularly good example. But I have a profound sense that Iraq is a disaster, that it will be draining, that it will become ever more apparent that we have nothing working for us politically and profound stuff working against us, that we have punched our hand into the largest hornet's nest in the world. I have a feeling that an economic policy that goes for tax breaks while you're fighting a 2-pronged war will eventually show itself. Two-pronged war. I mean, Afghanistan, the war on terrorism plus the war in Iraq, while cutting taxes, has some tripwires built in. So I don't think there's a mandate. He might be able to last it out. I mean, there is a control of the Senate, the House. But I would think that it's going to be a very, very, very difficult time, and I think the American people are going to be very unhappy as events unravel really, or show themselves as to what they are in Iraq. I think it's going to be quite tragic.
David, I'd like to address this question to you. My name is Don Ryan. I'm an ordinary citizen. My question really ties together the first panel and this panel. We're talking about the press and we're talking about enemies. And I was reminded that 30 years ago, I was a student at Boston College. I took a class called Propaganda in a War Climate. And Jack Beattie's comments earlier today really struck a chord with me when he made that very impassioned talk about propaganda and what might be going on in Iraq right now. So I wonder, do you think that the role of the press right now is to get out and maybe become an enemy of the administration? Or is it waiting for the people to come back out and stand on the steps of the Capitol or to occupy Lafayette Park? And then you'll report on our anti-war activities? Or should the press get out and say, there's a moral imperative for us to get out and make this an issue that draws attention for those people who aren't reading the papers or aren't reading the Atlantic Monthly?
Well, I think it's the job of the people to get out if there are issues that they should rally around. I don't think the press should take this kind of leadership role. I don't think that is its role. I think what we want is an independent press. We would like to have a press that spent more time investigating issues, but I think we underestimate the cost of that. Most reporters have to cover a dozen different stories in different fields, and they can't be experts in all those fields. So I don't think we should count on the press, turning them into our spiritual core or our investigative unit. I think if these are real issues that are a concern to the American people, then they have to get out and enunciate, and they have to find ways to move around the parties. If the party is bottled up in the House, an opposition party, or the House and the Senate, then I don't think that should be just the end of it. I think it's a time for some inventive politics, and we've had that. Certainly the anti-war movement in Vietnam didn't start in Congress. It started outside, outdoors, where Jefferson believed that political action ought to take place. And I think it's going to be a question of how seriously we take these issues, whether it's the tax cuts, or whether it's the war, or whether it's an aggressive foreign policy, or whether it's appropriate foreign policy. I don't think we should expect the press to do this.
Okay, I was just wondering because the press seemed to wear enemy of the president as a badge when you think about Dan Shore and others who talk about it even today, whether there would be a more activist press to maybe rally the folks to get out and do more than they're doing. I think it is the onus on the people to make that move. But
well, this was an administration that seemed almost press immune. I mean, that is, no matter what the reporting was, rather later than earlier in the game, about weapons of mass destruction, what was happening in Iraq, etc., it really didn't seem to have much effect. Essentially, I think it did, actually. I think if it had not been for the Iraq invasion and a growing sense in much of the country that it didn't work, the election would have been 55-45, as it was. It was turned into something of a cliffhanger, and I think the Bush people thought as late as the day of election that they might lose. I think that Iraq was a powerful undertow working against him. It was much, much closer, given the enormous political leverage for the White House that 9/11 gave it in terms of intimidating the opposition party and the media. The media is, it seems to me, for a variety of reasons, both more timid now because of 9/11, although beginning to come out of it, but structurally quite weaker than it was 30 or 40 years ago. The networks, never a great bastion of courage, but pretty good 30 years ago, are really in giant corporations now that don't like them, don't have any great respect for the newsrooms, and essentially want to get out of the news business. The many serious and rather good non-national papers, not unlike the one that Tom Wicker and I worked for in Tennessee, are now owned, and we're a very important part of a larger journalistic democracy, are now owned by great corporations like Gannett, and largely regard their real customers as people who buy the stock, not the people who buy the paper, and are really so bland as to be almost non-existent. You're down to 4 or 5 really very distinguished papers in the country, whether it's Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times, Washington Post, and a handful of others. It is just not as powerful an instrument as it was in general 30 years ago during Vietnam. Having said that, the truth gets out. It gets out. It's out there. And you can't, I mean, maybe the media should have been better in 2001, 2002, 2003 as this thing built up, but it wasn't. I don't know that it would have made any difference. But people know. Whether they know and will vote based on what they know is an intriguing question in this country at this time.
Thank you very much. Robert Frio, Builders for Humanity in Bosnia. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here to listen to all you esteemed scholars today. And I will apologize to Professor Waters for what happened in our historical past. It was an injustice that has and should be rectified by the President. My comment about the situation today is I am appalled by what my government's doing in Iraq. 100,000 Iraqi citizens have been slaughtered in the name of Christianity, police. You know, when are we going to wake up in this country? My second question to you all is how do we make the present administration, the leaders of our country, aware of the fact that 1/2 of the planet are Muslim, Chinese, or Indian, and we do nothing in our public schools to educate our students in this area. And we thank you all for being here.
I'm not sure the public schools don't. You mean that they don't teach about the culture and history of China and India?
Very little.
Oh, I think that's changing dramatically. In most universities, world history is replacing history of Western civilization. It takes a long time to move an institution, but there's been an interest for the last decade and a half in presenting world history and doing it in a very complicated, sophisticated, and appreciative way.
Very, very limited aspects in Chinese, Indian, and Muslim world. They don't have time. It's impossible to cover it. I've been in the field for 40 years. It's impossible.
I'm sorry, is that another question?
You can cover these areas for a couple of weeks and teach world history. They give you 10 months to teach world history. It's impossible to
Well, usually it's a year's course, but that's true of the knowledge of the world. It's very hard to compress what we know about biology into an introductory biology class. I mean, that's just one of the realities of our knowing so much about so many different things.
But if we could spend...
I think we have to go on and take other questions. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but I think we have other people waiting. Thank you.
Mr. Dean, you spoke of Nixon not really turning on enemies in the way that he did until the so-called enemies list was drawn up.
No, I think I said that I don't think he had any knowledge of there being an enemies list per se, not that he didn't turn on his enemies, to the contrary.
Oh, well, but I thought I understood you to be saying that it really didn't, that the intensity of the focus on identifying enemies and going after them. Whether I understood you correctly or not, isn't it true that there was a program, and what I'd like to ask about is, in terms of enemies of the president, are things like COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, that targeted American citizens who were engaged in lawful activity for illegal surveillance, disruption, and what they called neutralization, that even involved in cases of members of the Black Panther Party promising young leaders being murdered in their beds in the middle of the night, and we know about the case of Fred Hampton in Chicago in the fall of 1969. So my question is, if any of you could address the targeting of American citizens identified as enemies and the use of the state apparatus in ways that have been egregiously illegal to neutralize lawful public expression of opposition. There has been a vigorous opposition. You don't find it in Congress.
You've got to make it a short question.
Well, but
make it a short question.
Well, I had to at least explain, I think, what the content of the question was. Do we have an example, something like this now, with the outing of Valerie Plame? Would anyone care to comment about that? And do you, Mr. Dean, still believe, as I think you did a year or so ago, that there's a legitimate case to be made for the impeachment of George Bush?
I think I got the gist of your first part of your question about the enemies and targeting people. I don't deny that the COINTELPRO program, which would certainly be revealed in all of its ugliness, came out. That started pre-Nixon and ended post-Nixon. So it's one of those things that really didn't come to the White House level even. It's just one of those apparatus that was out there as a part of a mentality. And that goes on, and I think the exposure is the way that we resolve that problem. As for the case for impeachment, I certainly did spell it out in my book, Worse Than Watergate. Indeed, the fact that I thought a charge could be sustained, an impeachable case can be made against this president for the way he took the nation to war in Iraq. One of the interesting debates that came up during the Nixon impeachment proceedings was whether or not he should be impeached for secretly bombing Cambodia. It came out during the debate that, in fact, he hadn't been as secretive as people thought. He had told the House and Senate leadership and the ranking and minority members of the standing committees that had responsibility, and so that ended the debate. But as a result of the discussion during the impeachment inquiry, a number of members of both sides of the aisle went back and looked at what the founders had in mind, and indeed would quote and say, we want to send, as a result of our examination of this subject, a message to all future presidents that we, as people who are now in an impeachment inquiry, looking at the Constitution, looking at the debates, in particular the ratification debates, believe that any time a president falsely represents information to the Congress and does so with particularly an intention to take the country to war, that is clearly an impeachable offense. That case can be made, and I do make it in the book.
We tend not to impeach the presidents for being too jingoistic. Your question?
Anybody want to say about Valerie?
No, we're going on to this gentleman here.
I deal with that in the book, too, incidentally.
My name is Jared Izzo. I'm a sophomore here at Boston College. And I had an interesting experience with the election this fall, and I'd like to kind of put in perspective, Professor Burns, you talked a little bit about the voter turnout and everything, and I'd like to put my situation in perspective, perhaps nationally.
Speak into the mic.
Sorry. Better? Okay. I was a Kerry supporter from New York. I had a friend who was Kerry sympathetic, but was voting for Michael Badnarik, the Libertarian candidate. He's from Pennsylvania. What we ended up doing, because being from New York, my vote supposedly, quote-unquote, did not count, we ended up switching our votes, where I voted for Badnarik, and he voted for John Kerry, because he was from Pennsylvania, in a swing state. We viewed this as a successful venture, seeing as Kerry ended up winning Pennsylvania. Though it made sense in my particular situation with this, my friend here, what does this say as far as imagining the big picture? Because I'm just trying to understand that myself.
I think it means you're going to be senator from New York one day.
There was an entire brokerage system being set up on the internet for people to swap their votes, and it raises some interesting legal questions. Talk to your lawyer before you do it.
Before you go on C-SPAN.
I was struck by Professor Burns' comments about the long-lamented death of the American political parties. I've heard it said that we can date the beginning of the death of the current two-party system to Chicago in 1968, where the democratic machine was unveiled for being just so undemocratic, and that we haven't really developed a workable political system since then. From my point of view, the revision to the primary system, which was supposed to produce a much more lively and productive nominating process this past year than it did, was one more piece of evidence of that. The last piece of evidence I have is a sinking feeling that there is no Democratic Party to regroup in the aftermath of the Kerry defeat. I'd like to hear more about your views about when we lost effective political parties and what we might do to put them back together.
Well, this is a question I've been pondering as a political scientist most of my life. And I had hoped that because of the intensity of the Democratic primary conflict and of the whole presidential campaign, that there might be, even in this short period, a kind of rejuvenation of party. But I don't think that happened. And I talked about this with Howard Dean a few weeks ago to ask him a question that relates very much to this, which is how you bring out followers. The study of leadership is very much a study of followership. There is no leadership without followership. We have leadership in this country often without much followership. And by that I mean we don't have a mechanism that allows leaders to institutionalize support as would happen in the ordinary party system. So I asked Howard Dean about this, and he talked about new techniques of bringing out the vote, new techniques of enlisting, registering people, and we read a lot about that during the campaign. But I said, well, okay, but just how do you do that? And he said, buy my book. So I bought his book. It's the first time anyone's ever asked somebody to buy a book, and the man went down to a bookstore and bought the book. I bought Howard's book, and he lays out a very interesting program for rejuvenating the grassroots in a way that might relate the grassroots to parties, the rejuvenation of parties. But again, it's not very clear as to what he's asking. And it's not very clear what we can do in a polity so dominated as this whole afternoon has reminded us of by the big opinion organizations, to put it politely. So I think the answer to this question lies in the extent to which at least a large number of the people in the Democratic Party and also in the Republican Party who did get organized, who did go to other states and work like hell and put in tremendous commitments, to what extent will they not just dismiss everything because of this election outcome, but will think about staying in the party. And this probably calls, getting back to the organizational aspect of this, it probably calls for a whole new set of party organizations, much more effective than the typical party committee, of which I'm a member, at in the town and city level. And I think that's where we have finally not only a big organizational effort, but we have to have a big analytical effort, because we haven't yet found the secret of developing strong participatory Democratic parties.
But what did the Democratic Party in was not just the collision in Chicago in '68 with Mayor Daley. It was the move to all kinds of social forces which worked against the party of the New Fair Deal. The move to the suburbs, the coming of television, which could draw bigger crowds, better jobs in the private sector than the government apparatus of a city could provide. All these things diminished the forces of the Democratic Party. Jim, we're running out of time. We've really run out of time. Jim, did you say you wanted to say one last thing?
Just a half a minute, because
yeah. And does anybody else who's allowed to?
Well, I just want to point out that the two-party system as we know it now is not going to necessarily survive. And it's happened before, where parties have had, they are, after all, big tents under which various groups are under, and sometimes the grouping is ineffective. And we may be in the process of seeing any one of these two parties dissolving into some other kind of a collection. So I don't think because we see these parties in distress or decline in interest, that means that it cannot be changed. I mean, our history is one of many different parties emerging when there are issues that are extremely important. They aren't going to be attended to by either one. So I would just caution you that don't fix on saving these two parties. They may dissolve into different formations that will capture popular attention.
I want to go back to the very beginning of this wonderful afternoon, to Tom Wicker's comments. And you may not have meant this particularly, but I was so interested when you referred to the presidency, or the president, which is the subject of this conference, as he or she. He or she. And I thought, this is interesting. I don't remember a she president of the United States. And I would like to conclude my comments tonight by saying, I don't think we're going to really solve the problem of the presidency until we have a woman president. And if you want to know who I have in mind, that will have to come later.
Thank you all very much. David?